second of our Penn's Village reads, and we're really happy to have Olivia sharing today. The readers get to choose what they would like to read, and we've had a very good response to your choice. So looking forward to it.
I know. I have to say, I'm a little bowled over by the interest. So I hope that it delivers. And I am I'm using my Kindle on the iPad here. So you'll probably see a lot of the top of my head.
So Olivia, before we get started, we're going to ask Donna to mute everybody.
I'm in the process of doing that right now.
Okay, Olivia.
Okay, well, welcome everyone, and I'll do my best to speak clearly, but just signal if I need information. I'm reading chapter 10 from the book Invisible Women. It's called The Drugs That Don't Work, and this chapter addresses the lack of data that affects women's health care. I will be skipping some portions of the chapter, and we may not get to the end of the chapter, but I think that's okay. Chapter 10, The Drugs That Don't Work. It took 12 years for Michelle to receive a diagnosis. I was about 14 when I first started having symptoms, she tells me. I was too ashamed to go to the doctor for it. She kept her urgent, painful, frequent, sometimes bloody bowel movements a secret for 2 years. Until one night, it hurt too much to hide anymore. I couldn't move from the fetal position. I was afraid of dying. She was 16. Michelle's parents rushed her to the emergency room. A doctor there asked her in front of her parents if she could be pregnant. Explained because she hadn't had sex, and in any case, the pain was in her intestines. They wheeled me into the exam room without any explanation, put my feet in stirrups. The next thing I knew, a large cold metal speculum was crammed in my vagina. It hurt so badly, I sat up and screamed, and the nurse had to push me back down and hold me there, while the doctor confirmed that indeed I was not pregnant. She was discharged with nothing more than aspirin and advice to rest. Over the next decade, Michelle sought help from 2 more doctors and 2 male gastroenterologists, both of whom told her that her problems were in her head and she needed to be less anxious and stressed. At the age of 26, Michelle was referred to a female GP who scheduled her for a colonoscopy. It revealed that the entire left side of her colon was diseased. She was diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome and ulcerative colitis. Funnily enough, Michelle says, "My colon is not in my head." As a result of the extended delay in receiving a diagnosis and treatment, she was left with an increased risk of colon cancer. It's hard to read an account like this and not feel angry with the doctors who let Michelle down so badly. But the truth is that these are not isolated rogue doctors, bad apples that should be struck off. They are the products of a medical system which from root to tip is systematically discriminating against women, leaving them chronically misunderstood, mistreated, and misdiagnosed. It begins with how doctors are trained. Historically, it's been assumed that there wasn't anything fundamentally different between male and female bodies, other than size and reproductive function. And so for years, medical education has been focused on a male norm, with everything that falls outside that designated as atypical or even abnormal. References to the typical 70-kilogram man abound, as if he covers both sexes, as one doctor pointed out to me. He doesn't even represent men very well. By the way, I'm not reading the footnotes, although they are copious for the references. When women are mentioned, they are presented as if they are a variation on standard humanity. Students learn about physiology and female physiology, anatomy and female anatomy. The male body, concluded social psychologist Carol Tavris in her 1992 book, The Mismeasure of Woman, is anatomy itself. Modern doctors, of course, no longer refer to women as mutilated males, as Aristotle did, but the representation of the male body as the human body persists. A 2008 analysis of a range of textbooks recommended by 20 of the most prestigious universities in Europe, the United States, and Canada revealed that across 16,329 images, male bodies were used 3 times as often as female bodies to illustrate neutral body parts. A 2008 study of textbooks recommended by Dutch information was absent even in sections on topics where sex differences have long been established, such as depression and the effects of alcohol on the body, and results from men and women, even when women were excluded from the study. The few sex differences that did get a mention were hardly accessible via index or layout, and in any case tended to be vague one-liners, such as women who more often have atypical chest discomfort. As we'll see, only 1 in 8 women who have a heart attack report the classic male symptom of chest pain. So in fact, this description is arguably not vague, but inaccurate. The gender gaps found in medical textbooks are also present in your typical medical school curriculum. A 2005 Dutch study found that sex and gender-related issues were not systematically addressed in curriculum development. A 2006 review of CUR MIT, the US online database for medical school courses, found that only 9 of the 95 schools that entered data into the system offered a course that could be described as a women's health course. Only 2 of these courses, obstetrics and gynecology classes, taught in the 2nd or 3rd academic years, were mandatory. Even conditions that are known to cause the greatest morbidity and mortality in women fail to incorporate sex-specific information. 10 years later, another review found that the integration of sex and gender-based medicine in the US med schools remained minimal and haphazard, with gaps particularly identified in the approach to the treatment of disease and use of drugs. These gaps matter because, contrary to what we've assumed for millennia, sex differences can be substantial. Researchers have found sex differences in every tissue and organ system in the human body, as well as in the prevalence, course, and severity of the majority of common human diseases. There are sex differences in the fundamental mechanical workings of the heart. There are sex differences in lung capacity, even when these values are normalized to height. Perhaps related is the fact that among men and women who smoke the same number of cigarettes, women are 20 to 70% more likely to develop lung cancer. Autoimmune diseases affect about 8% of the population, but women are 3 times more likely to develop one, making up about 80% of those affected. We don't fully know why, but researchers think it might be down to women being the childbearing sex. The theory is that females evolved a particularly fast and strong immune response to protect developing fetuses and newborn babies, meaning that sometimes it overreacts and attacks the body. The immune system is also thought to be behind sex-specific responses to vaccines. Women develop higher antibody responses and have more frequent and severe adverse reactions to vaccines. And a 2014 paper proposed developing male and female versions of influenza vaccines. Sex differences appear even in our cells, in blood serum biomarkers for autism, in proteins, in immune cells used to convey pain signals, and how cells die following a stroke. A recent study also found a significant sex difference in the expression of a gene found to be important for drug metabolism. Sex differences in the presentation and outcome of Parkinson's disease, stroke, and brain ischemia, that's insufficient blood flow to the brain, have also been tracked all the way to our cells, and there is growing evidence of a sex difference in the aging of the blood vessels, with inevitable implications for health problems, examination, and treatment. In a 2013 Nature article, Dr. Elizabeth Pulitzer points to research showing that male and female mice cells have been found to respond differently to stress, that male and female human cells exhibit wildly different concentrations of many metabolites, and to mounting evidence that cells differ according to sex irrespective of their history of exposure to sex hormones. There are still vast medical gender data gaps to be filled in, but the past 20 years have demonstrably proven that women are not just smaller men. Male and female bodies differ down to a cellular level. So why aren't we teaching this? The inclusion of sex-specific information in textbooks is dependent on the availability of sex-specific data. But because women have largely been excluded from medical research, this data is severely lacking. Even the very basics of sex determination have a sex data gap. Since the landmark 1990 paper that identified the Y chromosome as the sex-determining region, the female sex has, the irony, been seen as the default. But in this case, the default didn't mean we focused on the female. Rather, research instead focused on testes development as the supposedly active process, while female sexual development was seen as a passive process. That is, until 2010, when we finally started researching the active process of ovarian determination. Most early research into cardiovascular disease was conducted on men, and women continued to be underrepresented, making up only 25% of participants across 31 landmark trials for congestive heart failure between 1987 and 2012. Women represent 55% of HIV-positive adults in the developing world and in parts of Africa and the Caribbean. Women aged 5 to 25 are up to 6 times more likely to be HIV positive than young men of the same age. We also know that women experience different clinical symptoms and complications due to HIV, and yet a 2016 review of the inclusion of women in US HIV research found that women made up only 19.2% of participants in antiretroviral studies, 38.1% in vaccination studies, and 11% in studies to find a cure. Because of the routine exclusion from clinical trials, we lack solid data on how to treat pregnant women for pretty much anything. We may not know how a disease will take hold or what the likely outcome may be, although the WHO warns that many diseases can have particularly serious consequences for pregnant women or can harm the fetus. Some strains of influenza virus, including the 2009 H1N1 swine flu virus, have particularly severe symptoms during pregnancy. There is also evidence that SARS can be more severe during pregnancy. It is, of course, understandable that a pregnant woman may be reluctant to take part in medical research, but this doesn't mean that we have to just throw our hands up in the air and accept that we know nothing. We should be routinely and systematically tracking, recording, and collating pregnant women's health outcomes. But we aren't, not even during pandemics. During the 2002-4 SARS outbreak in China, pregnant women's health outcomes were not systematically tracked, and consequently, the WHO points out, it was not possible to fully characterize the course and outcome of SARS during pregnancy. Another gender data gap that could have been so easily avoided, and in information that will be lacking for when the next pandemic hits. Like the failure to include women in anatomy textbooks, the failure to include women in medical trials is a historical problem that has its roots in seeing the male body as the default human body. But this traditional bias was radically enhanced in the 1970s to the great detriment of women's health, following one of the biggest medical scandals of the 20th century. In the 1960s, In 1960, doctors began prescribing thalidomide to pregnant women who suffered from morning sickness. In the wake of the thalidomide scandal, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration issued guidelines in 1977 excluding women of childbearing potential from drug trials. This exclusion went unquestioned. The acceptance of the male norm went unquestioned. The male norm continues to go unquestioned by many today, with some researchers continuing to insist, in the face of all the evidence, that biological sex doesn't matter. One public health researcher revealed that she had received the following feedback on 2 different grant applications. I wish you'd stop with all this sex stuff and get back to science. And I've been in the field for 20 years and this biological difference doesn't matter. It isn't just anonymous notes either. A 2014 op-ed published in the journal Scientific American complained that including both sexes in experiments was a waste of resources. In 2015, an op-ed in the official scientific journal of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences insisted that focusing on preclinical sex differences will not address women's and men's health disparities. Alongside insisting that sex differences don't matter, some researchers advocate against the inclusion of women in research on the basis that while biological sex may matter, the lack of comparable data arising from the historical data gap makes including women inadvisable. Talk about adding insult to injury. Female bodies, both the human and animal variety, are, it is argued, too complex, too variable, too costly to be tested on. Integrating sex and gender into research is seen as burdensome. These words are in quotation marks. It is seen as possible for there to be too much gender and for its inclusion to be acceptable on the basis of simplification. In which case, it's worth noting that recent studies on mice have actually shown greater variability in males on a number of markers. So who's complicated now? Beyond the argument that women's bodies with their fluctuating atypical hormones are simply inconvenient research vessels, researchers also defend their failure to include women in trials by claiming that women are harder to recruit. And it is certainly true that due to women's caregiving responsibilities, they have less leisure time and may find it harder to make, for example, clinical appointments during the school run. However, this is an argument for adapting trial schedules to women rather than simply excluding them. In any case, it is possible to find women if you really want to. While reviews of FDA-mandated medical product trials found that women made up only 18% of participants in trials for endovascular occlusion devices, used if your fetal blood vessel hasn't closed of its own accord, and 32% of participants in studies on coronary stents, which incidentally are another device where women have worse outcomes than men. Women represented 90% and 92% of participants in facial wrinkle correction trials and dental device trials, respectively. A more novel approach to addressing the problem of female underrepresentation in medical research is simply to claim that there is no problem and women are represented just fine. Thank you very much. In February 2018, a paper was published in the Gender Differences in Clinical Registration Trials. Is there a real problem? Following cross-sectional structured research into publicly available registration dossiers of the FDA-approved drugs that are prescribed frequently, the all-male authored panel concluded the problem wasn't real. Leaving aside any philosophical debate over what an unreal problem might be, the author's conclusions are baffling. For a start, data was available for only 28% of the drug trials, so we have no way of knowing how representative the sample is. In the data researchers were able to access, the number of female participants in over a quarter of the trials did not match the proportion of women in the US affected, I'm sorry, in the US supposed to treat. Furthermore, the study did not address trials for generic drugs, which represent 80% of prescriptions. The FDA describes a generic drug as a medication created to be the same as an already marketed brand name drug, and they are sold after the patent for the original branded drug runs out. Drug trials for generic drugs are much less rigorous than original trials, having only to demonstrate equal bioavailability, and they are conducted almost exclusively in young adult males. This matters because even with the same active ingredient, different inactive ingredients and different fabrication technology can affect a drug's potency. And sure enough, in a 2002, the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research showed statistically significant differences between men and women in bioequivalence for most generic drugs compared with reference drugs. Despite all this, the authors claimed that there was no evidence of any systematic underrepresentation of women in clinical trials because in phase 2 and 3 trials, women were included at 48% and 49% respectively. But the study authors themselves report that in phase 1 trials, women represented only 22% of participants. And contrary to what their conclusion might imply, the underrepresentation of women in phase 1 trials does matter. According to the FDA, the second most common adverse drug reaction in women is that the drug simply doesn't work, even though it clearly works in men. So with that substantial sex difference in mind, how many drugs that would work for women are we ruling out at phase 1 trials just because they didn't work in the men? The authors didn't consider the number of drug treatments that might be beneficial to women but never even reach human testing because they were ruled out at the cell and animal trial stage, and this number could be substantial. Sex differences in animals have been consistently reported for nearly 50 years, and yet a 2007 paper found that 90% of pharmacological articles described male-only studies. In 2014, another paper found that 22% of animal studies did not specify sex, and of those that did, 80% included only male animals. Perhaps most galling from a gender data gap perspective was the finding that females aren't even included in animal studies on female prevalent diseases. Women are 70% more likely to suffer depression than men, for instance, but animal studies on brain disorders are 5 times as likely to be done on male animals. A 2014 paper found that of studies on female prevalent diseases that specified sex, 44% of them, only 12% studied female animals. Even when both sexes are included, there is no guarantee the data will be sex analyzed. One paper reported that in studies where 2 sexes were included, 2/3 of the time the results were not analyzed by sex. Does this matter? Well, in the 2007 analysis of animal studies, of the few studies that did involve rats or mice of both sexes, 54% revealed sex-dependent drug effects. These sex-dependent effects can be extreme. Dr. Tammy Martino researches the impact of circadian rhythms on heart disease, and during a 2016 lecture to the Physiology Society, she recounted a recent shock discovery. Together with her team, she conducted a study which found that the time of day you have a heart attack affects your chances of survival. A heart attack that hits during the day triggers, among other things, a greater immune response. In particular, it triggers a greater neutrophil response. Neutrophils are a type of white blood cell that are usually first on the scene in response to any injury. And this response correlates with a better chance of survival. This finding has been replicated many times over many years with many different animals, becoming, explained Martino, the gold standard for survivorship in the literature. So Martino and her team were quite surprised when in 2016, another group of researchers released a paper which also found that daytime heart attacks triggered a greater neutrophil response, but that this correlated with a worse chance of survival. After a substantial amount of head scratching, they realized that there was one basic difference between the historic studies and this one new study. The old studies had all used all male mice, while this new paper had used female mice, different sex, totally opposite result. As for the cell studies, a 2011 review of 10 cardiovascular journals found that when sex was specified, 69% of cell studies reported using only male cells. And when sex was specified, is an important caveat. A 2007 analysis of 645 cardiovascular clinical trials, all published in prominent journals, found that only 24% provided sex-specific results. A 2014 analysis of 5 leading surgical journals found that 76% of cell studies did not specify sex, and of those that did, 71% included only male cells, and only 7% reported sex-based results. And again, even for diseases that are more prevalent in women, researchers can be found exclusively studying XY cells. As in animal and human studies, when sex has been analyzed in cell studies, dramatic differences have been found. For years, researchers were puzzled by the unpredictability of transplanted muscle-derived stem cells. Sometimes they regenerated diseased muscle, sometimes they didn't do anything, until they realized that the cells weren't unpredictable at all. It's just that female cells promote regeneration and male cells don't. Perhaps of more urgent concern for women's health is the 2016 discovery of a sex difference in how male and female cells respond to estrogen. When researchers exposed male and female cells to this hormone and then infected them with a virus, only the female cells responded to the estrogen and fought off the virus. It's a tantalizing finding that inevitably leads to the following question. How many treatments have women missed out on because they had no effect on the male cells on which they were exclusively tested? In light of all of this evidence, it's hard to see how researchers can continue to argue in good faith that sex doesn't matter. Rather, it seems clear that McGill University neuroscientist Jeffrey Mogul was right when he told the Organization for the Study of Sex Differences that failing to include both sexes right at the very beginning of your research is not only scientifically idiotic and a waste of money, it is an ethical issue as well. Nevertheless, women continue to be routinely underrepresented in medical research, and you can't even expect sex-specific trials to adequately represent women. When the female Viagra that was released with much fanfare in 2015 was found to potentially interact negatively with alcohol, as most readers will know, the absorption of alcohol differs between men and women, its manufacturer, Sprout Pharmaceuticals, quite rightly decided to run a trial, for which they recruited 23 men and 2 women. They did not sex disaggregate the data. In this latter failure, they are not alone. Several reviews of papers published in major journals over the past 10 years have all identified a routine failure to either present results by sex or to explain why the influence of sex has been ignored. A 2001 U.S. Government Accounting Office audit of FDA records found that about a third of documents didn't sex disaggregate their outcomes, and 40% didn't even specify the sex of the participants. The auditors concluded that the FDA had not effectively overseen the presentation and analysis of data related to sex differences in drug development, a finding that was confirmed in 2007 analysis of new drug applications submitted to the FDA, which found a failure to establish standards for data analysis of applications. In a 2015, the GAO criticized the U.S. National Institutes of Health for failing to routinely track whether researchers had actually evaluated any differences between the sexes. Things are often even worse in non-government funded trials, which represent the majority of studies. A 2014 investigation into sex analysis in cardiovascular trials found that 31 of 61 NIH-sponsored trials analyzed outcomes by sex compared with only 125 of 567 non-NIH-sponsored clinical trials. The lack of sex disaggregated data affects our ability to give women sound medical advice. In 2011, the World Cancer Research Fund complained that only 50% of studies into the impact of diet on cancer that included both men and women disaggregated their data by gender, making it hard to establish dietary guidelines for cancer prevention that are valid for both sexes. Women, for example, should probably eat more protein than men as they age because of muscle mass loss, but the optimal dose per meal to support muscle protein synthesis in older women has not been determined. The failure to sex disaggregate when you've actually gone to the effort of including both sexes is baffling, not to mention, as Londa Schiebinger at Stanford University puts it, money wasted and research that is lost to future meta-analysis. And when female representation in trials is so low, the ability to conduct meta-analysis can mean the difference between life and death. In a 2014 a review of the FDA database of cardiac resynchronization therapy device, CRTD, essentially a more complicated kind of pacemaker, trials found that women made up 20% of participants. The number of women included in each individual study was so low that separating out the data for men and women didn't reveal anything statistically significant. But when the review authors combined all of the trial results and did disaggregate that data, they found something alarming. A CRTD is used to correct a delay in your heart's electrical signals. They are implanted for established heart failure, and the D stands for defibrillator. This defibrillator, a larger version of which most of us will have seen in one hospital drama or another, performs something like a hard reset on the heart, shocking it out of its irregular rhythm so that it can restart in its correct rhythm. A doctor I spoke to described CRTDs as a symptom control. They aren't a cure, but they prevent many early deaths, and if your heart takes 150 milliseconds or longer to complete a full electrical wave, you should have one implanted. If your heart completes a full circuit in under that time, you wouldn't benefit from one, unless the meta-analysis found you happen to be female. While the 150 milliseconds threshold worked for men, it was 20 milliseconds too high for women. I'm going to just pause there because I've read for a half hour, and we are not quite at the end of the chapter, although that might be a good stopping place if you want to have discussion. Can we unmute so I can hear folks?
There you go. I've unmuted everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Donna.
I think it's going swimmingly.
Good, good. Do you want me to continue, or do you want to stop and have some discussion about what the things that have stuck with you?
I think discussion now would be relevant.
Olivia, we don't necessarily have to stop. We can keep going. So if if everybody wants to just hear the end and ask as many questions as they want, we can certainly do that.
How much more is there of it?
I'm just looking here since I've got the Kindle. Let me just check. We probably have about 10 pages. The pages are kind of small because I made the type bigger, but I would say it's probably 10 more minutes.
Well, oh, okay.
Now, excuse me, what goes through my mind is all the data that that the book talks about. Most of the studies were 2014. I'm wondering, what is it like now? Is the medical field, has it learned anything about this, the differences?
I think that most of the last citations are like 2017. There's a lot of footnotes. So I'd have to look through all of them to see. But and this book is a year old. So if you think it came out in 2019, and it's a book rather than an article.
Right. So 19, which meant it was probably written in 18, most of it.
A lot of it. Sure.
A lot of it.
So we're a little, although it seems to be a very consistent pattern over many years.
Yes.
So unless there's been a revolution.
Yeah.
I haven't heard of one.
Yeah.
I think a lot of what you're reading is getting a little repetitive. It's just giving more and more examples of the same point. So I'd be for going to our own conversation now.
I think that makes sense too. She's just trying to really cut, she's trying to be exhaustive so that hoping that I think researchers will be like, oh, here's a research opportunity. I can sell data in women. I can look at.
I'm curious as to why she kept using sex difference rather than gender difference.
Right. Because in the medical, I can answer that one actually, having read the book, but also because my field, because she's looking at medical treatment. And certainly when it comes to psychology and psychiatry, the gender might be important. But if you're looking at how do I solve anemia, your cells don't have a gender identity. They just are XXs or XYs.
But
Are there any suggestions for addressing the problem, such as putting pressure on the journals that publish these articles?
Well, the journals don't direct the researchers to study something. It would really be the organizations that do affect research are those that fund it. So medical research is going to be funded by, NIH, pharma companies, big pharma, CDC, I found it, one thing that stuck out to me, I don't know if it stuck out to others, and then I'm really curious to hear your reactions more than me talking, is the stronger autoimmune response in women being so significant, because I did read an article about COVID where women aren't dying at they have much lower mortality from COVID from all the studies. And researchers in the article that I read had posited it was because women have a stronger autoimmune response.
Yes, I saw something on the news with one of the physicians, can't remember which one. He pointed out that the immune response depends on the X chromosome, and since women have 2 of those and men only have one, that's why they have stronger immune responses, which made sense to me.
Yeah.
Right, I heard that, and I wonder if that won't start more conversations in the medical field and more research focusing on women. It's such a good study right now.
Yeah, a good example.
A good example.
Yeah.
Good example. Just a question about the book. Is the entire book on medical, or does it go into invisible women in all phases of life?
All phases, everything from their chapter on city infrastructure. You'll find, like she finds that the funding goes to things that benefit men.
Yeah.
You know, like for, you know, city streets and, you know, whether, you know, the bus system, the way it's organized, everything.
Since I
Could you-
had
Could you read us some of the chapter titles?
Sure, yeah, let me just pull up my table of contents here. Oops. There we go. So here she divides it, just to give you kind of a landscape, into 6 parts. So the chapter that we were listening to was from the going to the doctor part. There are 2 chapters in that. And then there's daily life, which is about sort of the design of buildings and cities. There's the workplace in terms of the way it's work hours are structured, and adaptation to the workplace for women. There's one on design, the design of everything from can openers to, you know, chairs to, you know. There's one on public life, and that's on sort of human rights and the way that's regulated, the kind of rights that are recognized as important. And then there's a final part is about how do we rebuild, who would rebuild, and then also one on this one on rebuilding looks also at disaster recovery and how women are disadvantaged in disasters, whether it's war or hurricane or tornado.
Wow.
So, Olivia, how are they disadvantaged?
Well, the thing is, and she really emphasizes here, that there's no sort of cabal, right? It's just, she's like, only men are planning, and when only men are planning, this is what you get. So it's about the way that funds are spent at a time of disaster.
But that's not really true, given how I've been impressed to see how many female governors there are. And the governors and mayors have had a big say in what's going on right now. So that seems a little bit.
Well, she has the data in there. I don't remember the chapter, but actually there are not many women governors.
No, and I think that's a recent phenomenon too.
Yeah.
Yes, especially since 2018, that was a big influx of women into government. I'm also finding things have changed quite a bit in medicine. I went to nursing school in the 1970s, and much of this was very true then. But since then, more and more women are becoming doctors. We have, and that's a change because traditionally nurses were women and men were doctors, but now there are more women doctors, and things are quite different now. In medical school, they see that a lot of this doesn't apply to them from their own experience. So it's kind of self-correcting as women get into more fields. But I know it's very true in medicine in particular.
There are 6 Democratic women governors and 3 Republican governors that are women.
Nice.
Out of 50.
Thank you, Google.
Out of 50.
Well, it's better than none.
I did research because I just wrote a book having to do with human sexuality. And still, that's a course that's optional in medical school. And they really focus on reproduction and disease. Menopause, forget it. I mean, a doctor really has to go out of their way. They usually learn about it once they have their MD, if they do. Even gynecologists, and the way they deal with it, even once they have the information, quite often is very destructive to the woman. It's very scary, actually.
It is alarming. I wonder if any research is being done on transgender people now too.
That would really be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a great blank there in terms of data on the sexuality experience and development of sexuality in transgender folks.
Olivia, can you give us the credentials and a little background on the author?
Yeah, she is a British, let me look it up so I don't.
All right, can you tell me her name?
Yes, it is Criado Perez. I've forgotten her first name. Caroline Criado Perez. She has one parent who is British and one who is Brazilian, and she grew up in both places. She is a journalist and describes herself also as an activist, as you can see, and has been the leader instituting a number of projects promoting women in public life in Britain. And she's written a lot of, she's also got an OBE and is still pretty young, so, which is, impressive.
What's an OBE?
Officer of the British Empire.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
But it's one of the like New Year's honors list things. So you have to be quite a leader in your field to receive it.
Interesting. A few months ago, I attended a lecture given by a woman, professor from Pittsburgh, who teaches women's studies. And this was her topic, about women just not making the progress that we think they are. As we said, there are several women governors now, but when you look at the whole thing, she had chart after chart after chart. And she feels that maybe by 2060, women will be the equals.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's documented over and over. As far as when you say the office, big corporations, no. Just because one or two get in, there's this huge fuss about it. But compare it, and it's still very, very difficult for women.
We're talking about the United States here.
Yeah, this is what she was a bit. Yeah,
that is clearly not the case. And if you look at all the countries that have really done such a wonderful job in terms of containing COVID, they're all headed by women.
Right.
That's
oh, that's a whole other topic.
She does have, in one of her chapters, she does look at that, what different policies get enacted when women are around the table, or not solely women, of course, but when it's a diverse group. I'm curious to what do you all think about that issue? And now I've forgotten who just raised it. That about the idea of progress, because we've certainly made progress, but it doesn't seem, sometimes you feel like, oh yeah, we've gotten so far, and then you're like, oh, wait a minute. Why do we, like, even amongst us, our intuition was different. As Marjorie was like, but wait a minute, there's so many women governors out there. And then others of us had different intuitions. Why do you think that is? Because the facts are the facts. I mean, whatever they are.
Yeah.
Well, I think compared to the way it used to be, it certainly appears that women are making some significant inroads, and especially when you see businesses owned by women-owned businesses, not corporations necessarily, but there are a lot of women in key positions in large corporations now as well. So, and this would never have happened. And in fact, where's I don't know who it was that said that she was a nurse, but look how long it took for women to even be admitted into medical school or law school, and now they're making up significant numbers.
I think we really have to look back. I spent most of my career in a library at a women in law school. Now it's probably more than half.
Right.
I'm part of a local group that goes into medical schools to talk about the ovarian cancer that we had, and I'm seeing the same thing in medical school. It's getting to half that are women, and that's really encouraging.
Yes.
We tend to forget that. We have to.
But we
That's how it
also
used to be.
need to note that while women are more, they still all go into, not all, but hugely overrepresented in primary care and pediatrics, which don't pay for, toffee. And the, plastic surgeons and the dermatologists are all men.
I think it's it takes a very long time. I think I went to medical school. I'm a physician, and I went to the first school in the world that admitted women. And
Where'd you go?
Well, it was called then Medical College of Pennsylvania, but it had been Women's Medical College.
Women's Medical.
And it was founded in 1848. Now, that was a long time ago. And it's taken a long time for women to even get to the point where now there are about half physicians are women. And but that has been the case for a little while, and nothing has changed in these studies that you're talking about. I think the society has an enormous amount of inertia in making this kind of change.
I think it also has to do with the differences between men and women's value systems. What the priorities for women, and I know I'm generalizing, but I think women's priorities have to do with their relationships, and men's priorities have to do with status, which they get from money and different power positions. I think that women, for the most part, have been satisfied with their role as nurturers and raising children, and they saw that as their power. But I think they are getting weary of men being in charge, and they are finally deciding to take more of an active role in other positions.
My experience has been as a computer programmer until I retired 10 years ago. And my experience in that profession has been very puzzling in this context, because the company that I worked for many years, Computer Sciences Corporation, basically did defense work. And the workforce there was, if anything, there was slightly more women programmers than there were men, and nobody thought a thing about it.
Wow.
But if you look at Silicon Valley now, it's a field that's famous for being hostile to women. I don't understand what happened in that profession. It's very strange.
It's really interesting. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was, before I went to medical school, I was a programmer. And now this was in the 60s. And many women were programmers then. I mean, it was a new, I've read that the first programmers were women.
Yeah, they are.
This was a field that was started by women.
That's true.
Yeah.
And now, I read an article and some kind of op-ed in the Times a few years ago by a woman who claimed that she was a pioneer in programming in the 80s, which is ridiculous. But women have left that field for some reason that I don't understand.
I just want to chime in because I'm a retired engineering ethics professor, and my degree is in history of science and technology and medicine. And I'm like,
Yay for you.
Great.
programmers to start, but also, and I can tell you, like what I saw teaching young people in engineering is that engineers who I taught for 2 decades, I saw there are very few women in, and the men get rid of them in the first year. And they do this by systematically, men, I mean, boys, you know, they're teenagers, systematically ganging up on them and abusing them. And it took me a while to learn this because finally one of the young women told me, but like they have to work in teams. So the woman will be the only woman on the team. And then she's told by the men, you're never going to make it. You're going to end up dropping out. You can't cut it. You can't. And they do that. They are like a gang. You know, it is hideous.
Olivia, what time frame was that when this was going on?
Well, I just retired last year.
And this was going on that recently?
2 years ago.
I'm going to step out from behind the curtain and add to the conversation. I think that if you look at films like, what was the one that came out about the women computers who worked for NASA?
Hidden Figures.
Thank you, Hidden Figures. Back in the day, those were considered secretarial positions.
Yes.
Those were administrative roles. Those were beneath the men to work at that level. So that's where I think the women developed those fields. And then as those fields became more corporate, more in the inventive and more the direction the company was going in, then the men stepped in and said, we're going to be in charge of this now. And that's where you get that the men really said, okay, women, World War II is over. You can go back to the kitchen now.
That's right.
And that was what the 1950s was all about, was women returning to the home. And, you know, the 60s and 70s, women were a little bit more, hey, we don't have to be in the home. We can be out in the workforce. But I think that's some of where, you know, these fields did originate with women. But they were in roles where the men either weren't available to work because they were at war, or they were considered secretarial positions, old-fashioned computer position.
Yeah. And of course, when the men came back from the war, then there was the GI Bills for the men that were in the war. And the women all went back to doing their housework, or the men came back to the jobs. No one thought about keeping those women on the job or making it easier for them to go to school also. It was all about the men at that point.
Yep. And the women could be fired from their role, their job, to make way for returning male soldiers.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was part of the deal. Exactly.
Yeah. This is Margaret. I read a book recently whose title I unfortunately can't remember, which was on artificial intelligence and the kind of bias, that gender bias that is in it, because the software developers tend to be men. And it was scary to think about because, you know, we have all kinds of devices now that rely on artificial intelligence. And it's sort of a black hole, you know, these systems that are, you know, able to learn, but if they're set up in the wrong way, they just can't detect this bias. And there's been some news journalism on this with respect to programs that analyze which defendants should get cash bail or not. And I think New Jersey is using a system. I know there was some debate in Pennsylvania. I don't know the status. but it's really unclear exactly what's being evaluated, and one suspects that it's not fair.
Related to artificial intelligence, it's interesting that both Siri and Alexa are very soothing and accommodating female voices.
This book mentions that. No, I went to a presentation.
How about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And interestingly, some of the first attempts to create robots that were kind of like human companion,
Right.
or, you know, kind of that kind of artificial intelligence. They were they all designed them. They were all designed by men. They were all female, and they were either secretaries or porn helpers. Now there's a data gap.
Oh my God.
Harry?
I hear somebody chiming in there.
I think he's talking to other people in his house.
Yeah, I think so too. It's 5:00. It's just after 5, and I can't recall how long we had set aside. I just don't want to keep like, you know, not be a timekeeper here.
We had been scheduled for an hour, but we can certainly go over if everyone's interested.
Okay.
I think I'm going to say thank you so much, Olivia and Kids Village. And I just need to get out.
Sounds like a very interesting book.
So good.
Thank you very much, Olivia.
Thank you. And I just think we're all getting ready to go make dinner. And I so appreciate hearing this discussion. And I hope you'll all come to our happy hour once we're back open, and so we can all see each other's whole
yeah.
Thank you, Olivia.
Thank you.
I'm going to work on my male robot making dinner.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Bye.
I love that.